Okay, so here we are at the top of Ross Creek, effectively what could be considered its headwaters. And we come here because it's the last section of catchment which has remnant vegetation in it, which would have been characteristic of much of the catchment up to this point before it was removed. The paper barks like we have here on my left and right were stripped out, and the big eucalypts were left, and it created a eucalypt grassland environment. Here, however, we still have those paper barks. We have no clearly defined channel here. So when it rains, the water percolates through this vegetation, giving the opportunity for that water to actually infiltrate into the landscape and then discharge over a longer period of time further downstream. And I think that's something that's worth noting, is when you do look around here, you don't see a clearly defined channel. So use what you see here as a comparison to everything that's come before this point in our virtual field trip. This is what was down where we started this morning and moved up, and the engineers went in there in the 70s, stripped out the vegetation, actually created a channel for the water to flow through and move it out through the catchment quickly, rather than this environment giving it the opportunity to infiltrate into the soil profile, into the groundwater, and then slowly drain out as base flow. One of the questions that's often raised is, why retain an area like this in a catchment or in an urban landscape, given the value that we place on land in urban areas to build on? Why would we want to keep this? What value does it have? Well, it has huge value in terms of minimizing or reducing the amount of water that flows down a catchment like Ross Creek. As I said previously, the water has the opportunity here to infiltrate into the soil profile. So that means that your engineering works further downstream don't need to be as comprehensive or as large scale to accommodate water flowing out of the catchment in high rainfall events, because these environments are able to actually hold that water back and release it over a longer period of time. Of course, it has aesthetic values. It provides an environment in which people can come and recreate as they walk around this area, and some of the other developments that we have here in southeast Queensland, there'll be walkways through these environments, like out at the Boondall Wetlands, for example. Of course, it has a conservation value. Okay, it provides a remnant of natural habitat for flora and fauna. And often many of these areas are undergoing rehabilitation works to remove weeds and invasive species which have moved in here, often from people's gardens, as they have sought a quick way to dispose of their waste rather than taking it to a controlled refuse environment. They've dumped it in these sort of environments because they've been considered as wastelands. However, as time's progressed and people have become more informed and, I suppose, conscious of the environment in which they live, there is a higher value placed on these settings, and therefore often many of them are undergoing remedial activities with local catchment care groups and so forth to reintroduce native species and to remove those exotic and invasive species which have colonised these areas. As a meteorologist, climatologist, I'm interested in these areas and urban landscapes because they provide a cooler environment. We learn about urban heat islands and how changing of a landscape from a natural, well-vegetated, well-watered or moist environment to something which is made out of concrete and asphalt. And the fact that more energy is then converted into sensible heat, which goes into heating the atmosphere. And we sense that as higher temperatures, and in urban landscapes like Brisbane, that equates to about 2 to sometimes 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it would naturally be. In bigger cities around the world, that urban heat island effect can be up to 6 degrees Celsius, and it will increasingly become a problem as we move through this century and climate warms. Not only do we have to deal with the issue of background climate warming, but we also have to deal with local warming attributed to the introduction of concrete, asphalt into our urban landscapes and the removal of water and that heat island effect. By retaining these areas in our urban landscapes, we have settings where more of the available energy goes into latent heat flux. So in this environment here, where we still have plentiful natural vegetation, more of the available radiant energy that comes from the sun is converted into latent heat. It goes into evaporating moisture from these environments, and therefore temperatures remain cooler. Okay, not so much of that energy goes into sensible heat, which we would naturally sense as an increase in ambient air temperature. More goes into evaporation. So as a consequence of that, we have cooler air temperatures in these settings. And of course, we refer to them as urban cool islands. And they are very useful at moderating the heat island effect. So in terms of thinking about the value of these and why we should retain them in urban landscapes, as climate warms and our cities become warmer, we need to ensure that we retain these areas to try and mitigate that background warming. And that has flow-on effects. You know, people prefer to live next to these environments. It's cooler, they use less energy to run air conditioning to actually reduce the effect of that background warming. So urban cool islands are fundamentally important. And you'll see, once again, many developments and new developments that are taking place, not just in Brisbane, but right across Australia, in our large cities, will have a focus around water and retention of this sort of natural landscape. And one of the reasons for that is to actually retain urban cool islands in our large cities to mitigate the effect of background warming. Okay, in terms of the urban cool island effect, if we're thinking about urban design and how we build our cities and how we create different spaces for different groups within our urban landscape, we might consider, for example, using this setting as a setting which would complement aged care facilities. People who are worst affected by extremes of heat are either the very young or the very old. And by integrating these sorts of areas in our urban landscape with the allocation of space for the likes of aged care facilities is very creative. It has very beneficial. These areas are ideal for locating aged care facilities next to because they provide that cooler climate in our urban landscapes. And that means that those individuals, particularly aged people who have less ability for their bodies to be able to adapt to high temperatures, have a cooler environment in which to live.